Really get to the business end of today's gathering. As mentioned, my name is Penyo Moroka, and I'll be helping to run the proceedings and run the program for the rest of the day. Because we're a little bit behind time, we're going to get straight into it. If you've had a chance to have a look at the program, you'll notice that there's about 4 sessions that are planned for today. All those sessions will be moderated by one moderator, Mr. Joel Makower, who is a leading authority, leading thinker and speaker on issues of business and green business in particular. He's also chairman and executive editor of GreenBiz Group, does a lot of work with entrepreneurs and startups, and in fact, he sits and advises several startups and sits on the boards of nonprofits Climates Count and United Roots. So ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome our moderator for today, Mr. Joel Makower.
Thank you, Penyo. Good morning. Dumelong. The conversation that we are having here today, in fact, all this week in Gaborone, is part of a much, much bigger global conversation that's taking place by some of the world's biggest companies, most innovative startups, forward-thinking public officials, civil society, students, and so many more. And it's an extraordinary time and a very, very exciting time to have these conversations. Exciting because we have extraordinary challenges. I don't think I need to tell you about the nature of those challenges. We'll be talking about some of them today. But also unprecedented opportunities, which is where I live. I have the great good fortune to be part of a team of about 20 people based in the United States and California. And we wake up every day thinking about how the world's largest companies and most innovative entrepreneurs are rethinking their products and processes and business models, their relationships with their customers, their employees, their stakeholders, upstream, downstream, midstream, in the name of creating a better world, the world in which we all want to live. It really is, I think, one of the most exciting things going on in business. It's happening across sectors, it's happening across borders, and we're just now really getting started. Is it unprecedented? Absolutely. Is it necessary? Yes, it certainly is. Is it sufficient? Not yet. And that's where all of us come in. This is the conversation we're going to be having about what we all need to be doing individually and collectively, and how each of you, each of us, needs to show up and stand up and speak up about so many of these issues in ways that we have never done before. In many cases, it'll be pushing us outside of our comfort zone. In some cases, it'll be leading us to have conversations with partners and sometimes strangers that we have not yet engaged. But all of this is really part of this transformation that is taking place. And so in some ways, we really are talking about reinventing business, reinventing government, and reinventing the relationships that all of us have with business, with our political leaders, with our customers, and really thinking about what we can be doing in a different way. This is really hard stuff. I will say that from the start. I think it's really important to know that a lot of the conversations we'll be having are about things that are just kind of new, just getting going, but extraordinarily difficult. Easy to say, very, very hard to do. In many ways, it's obvious it's about change. The change we all know, change we all need, but change is hard. I like to say that when it comes to change, we like the noun, not so much the verb. That we like the idea of change, but the act of changing can be very, very difficult. So what we're going to talk about is what are the changes we need to create in the world? How do we do that? How do we do that individually? And more importantly, how do we do that together? So we're going to be hearing from a number of speakers, some presentations, some conversations. You'll see a lot more chairs coming up. We'll be having open dialogue with a number of very thoughtful and influential people who have been working at the front lines of this from a number of different angles, both within the diamond industry and the mining industry, but so many other parts of the business and public policy arena. So let's get on with it. We're going to start off with talking about this extraordinary set of goals that's been set before us by 190 plus countries in the United Nations. And to talk about that, please join me in welcoming to the stage the UNDP, United Nations Development Program, Resident Representative for Botswana, Her Excellency, Mrs. Jacinta Barrins. And as she comes up, we're going to start with a very brief video.
We can be.
We must be.
The first generation
to end extreme poverty.
The generation
most determined
to fight injustice and inequalities.
The generation that saves the planet from climate change.
And this is how it will get done. The global goals.
A 15-year plan
For everyone, everywhere.
With no one left behind.
We will live in a world
where nobody
anywhere
lives in extreme poverty.
Where no one
goes hungry.
Where no one wakes in the morning asking if there will be food today.
We will live in a world where no child has to die of
diseases we know how to cure.
And where proper health care
is a lifelong right for us all.
We will live in a world
where everyone goes to school.
And education gives us the knowledge
and skills
for a fulfilling life.
We will live in a world where all girls and all women have equal opportunities
to thrive
and be powerful
and safe.
We cannot succeed if afterwards head back.
We will live in a world
where all people can get clean water
and proper toilets
at home, at school, and at work.
We will live in a world where there's
sustainable energy for everyone.
Heat, light,
and power for the whole planet.
without destroying the planet.
We will live in a world where economies prosper.
and new wealth.
lead to decent jobs
for everyone.
And we will live in a world where our industry,
our infrastructure, and our
Best innovations
Are not just used to make money, but to make all our lives better.
we will live in a world
Where prejudices and extremes of inequality
Are defeated.
Inside our countries,
and between different countries.
where people live in cities and communities
that are safe, progressive,
and support everyone who lives there.
where we replace
what we consume.
Planet where we put back
What we take out of the earth.
We live in a world that is decisively rolling back the threat of climate
change.
where we restore and protect the life in our oceans and seas.
will restore
And protect life on land.
The forests,
Animals,
The earth itself.
With peace between and inside countries.
where all governments are open.
And answer to us for what they do at home and abroad.
And the justice rules.
with everyone equal before the law.
Where all countries and we their people
Work together.
Partnerships of all kinds.
To make these goals a reality.
These are the United Nations global goals
For sustainable development.
Let's get to work.
So, good morning, everyone. Was that exciting or challenging, or now are you feeling this is impossible? I took away one or two words that they have said, and that is, and I will talk about it, the word partnerships, and also the word leave no one behind. So I'll start by saying all protocol observed, and thanks to De Beers and the Ministry of Natural Resources for this opportunity to speak on behalf of UNDP. I'd like to start by saying the time is right. And why am I saying it's right? Just 2 years ago, as we have heard, 193 nations went to New York on behalf of their governments and said, we are committing to the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'd like to talk a little bit, what are these things called Sustainable Development Goals? And then I want to go on and give a case of why we should have partnerships with the private sector. There are many other partnerships, but I'll focus a little bit on the private sector. And then I'll go on to give some examples that UNDP is partnering with private sector here on the continent of Africa, and conclude with some examples here in Botswana. So, what is these things called SDGs? I'd rather not use the word Sustainable Development Goals, and let me explain why. We get bogged down in the word sustainability, and we heard at the opening of the conference this morning by the CEO, he gave many examples of sustainability. And then we say, development goals, what does that mean? So let me give you a little bit of history. Way back in 2013, the Secretary General invited many people around the world to decide what will the next development challenges focus on. Because the Millennium Development Goals, which were 8, were about to finish in 2015. Many panels of distinguished speakers around the world engaged, and many governments. So I'm sure everybody here, your government, took part in deciding what are the development challenges that you want to address over the next 15 years. But it wasn't just governments. The private sector also stepped in and created discussions and said, what is it in this country here that we think should be a development challenge? The youth got involved, schools got involved, children got involved, and together these development challenges were put in various reports. But as time went by, you could see the development challenges were this big, and people said, no, this is far too daunting. We can't go with this. We had 8 already. So a lot of work went into condensing them down to make them 17. So I am saying 17 challenges. Let me give you an example. The first goal is on the challenge of poverty, how to eradicate poverty. The second one, looking at hunger. The third one, health and well-being. The fourth one, education. Fifth one, gender, and so on and so on. So the idea is focus on a development challenge. And then how can we address it? So once they agreed consensus that yes, we'll have these 17 challenges that we're going to be looking at over the next 15 years, they then said, okay, how am I going to achieve them? I need targets. So they put a target against each challenge. And then thought, no, I need another target, another target. And here we have now 17 of these development challenges that was converted into goals, and then targets added. And now we have 169. You see? It's getting bigger already. And then the country said, yes, that's great. Now we've got a challenge. We're clear. It's either inequalities, it's poverty, it's environment, it's about peace and security. How will I measure it? So I'm looking at now a target, and I'm looking at an indicator. I need to know how I'm doing. And now guess what? There's 230 indicators. So if you were frightened by that video, now we have 17 challenges, 169 targets, and over 230 indicators. And we've all signed up to it. But we went further. And what the development goals and the panel forming this around the world decided on a few principles, and you saw them come out in the video. They said, okay, we have all these development challenges, but we want something to underpin this. And that is going to be inclusiveness. We are going to leave nobody behind. So we're going to, in our looking at development challenge, not look at just the rurals and the urban areas. We're going to that farthest place and seeing how can we help. So if we talk about poverty reduction, we're not just talking about pockets around the capital. We'll go right out to that rural area. So one of the principles you will hear often said is leave no one behind. And when the moderator was saying, this is difficult and it's hard and we must stand up. Today, I believe each of you have got this little symbol here in your packets. So by wearing it, you are saying, I'm standing up. I'm going to advocate for SDGs going forward. And just by the act of wearing it, Somebody will ask, what is this? And you're advocating for it. It's a small journey. The second indicator, or the second principle that was proposed and agreed by all member states, was universality. What do you mean when we say universality? It means that these 17 development challenges are important for every country around the world, yours and mine. With the Millennium Development Goals, it just focused on the developing world. These are different. Inequality is in my country as it is in yours. Environment issues are in my country as yours. Gender issues, poverty issues, health issues, education issues. So the principle of universality applies here. So that was the second principle all member states agreed. And the third one was sustainability. And you've heard the CEO talk about sustainability, so I'm not going to talk about that. So the assumption is that as we go to implement this, we need peace and security, we need good governance, we need good human rights. So that's expected that that will be there. But once it was assigned, what happened? Most governments had to go back to their countries and say, now what do we do? How do we translate this into action? And every country around the world, in yours and mine, decided on a lead ministry. Here in Botswana, it's the Ministry of Economic and Finance. In your country, you'll have decided who is the ministry going to lead. Why a lead ministry? It is to encourage and promote leadership and inclusiveness. Inclusiveness of all partners. It is an all-society approach. It's not just government. And the topic today is very much get involved in the private sector. It is about the involvement of private sector, the youth, the academic world. So a lead ministry started to roll out this lead function, and then sectors began to look at what they can do. A lot up until now has been the domain of the government. So this conference, the timing is great. Why? Because it's a renewed call for the private sector to be involved. This is not just the business of government. This is the business of government, the private sector, the academic world. So by this partnership, then governments are now saying, okay, we cannot do it alone. Let us bring on board our friends, our partners in development, and hence the reason for the private sector. So I'd like to make two cases why the private sector should be involved. You all know, but maybe I'll take it from a particular angle. Way back again in 2015, there was a conference held in Addis that tried to look at what money would be required to implement the SDGs. And this figure may be frightening for you. It said $3 trillion per year. Imagine. Governments and ODA's figures, it's too much. It's not possible around the world. So they have to partner. And they partner with the private sector. And why? In Africa, the private sector is approximately 60% of the GDP. So the argument is clear. They're 80% of the capital flows, and they're 90% of the jobs. So if you have got that resource sitting there, they are the partners to do what? To help to implement these development challenges, which we are calling goals. So now let me look at, from a business case, the SDGs is the potential offer of the biggest markets and innovative opportunities to look at traditional basic needs. That's an opportunity that all of us in the private sector should really look at and see how can we come together. We also see that there are huge opportunities in the environment sector to have clean and resilient businesses and innovation. Let me just take the word innovation. Where the private sector excels is in innovation. They have the money and the resources to twin up another partnership with research institutions and their own research to bring about innovation. And we have heard what I'm calling development challenges, converted into goals, is the transformational agenda. That's it. We talk about transformational agenda, that's it. And the AU and the 2063 vision for Africa, that's the transformational agenda that we're all buying up to. And the recent Sustainable Development Conference also zoomed in for the private sector and looked at areas of agriculture, resilient infrastructure, industrialization, innovation, and sustainable management of natural resources. So there's an array of areas that the private sector can get involved in. If you look at the 17 development challenges, most private sectors, there is somewhere that you can engage. You can engage to support, to help to address it. But let's look at another way. If you're a private sector, let's look at your own workforce. You heard the moderators talking about bringing about change. How can we encourage change within our own staff, within our own private organizations? Can they be ambassadors to really encourage some of the principles? Leave nobody behind, universality, sustainability. So let's start at home in our own private organization, and then use opportunities to move out and help out in the bigger arena. So let me focus on one or two examples, or three examples from what UNDP has been doing to bring on board the partnerships, private sector. In Ethiopia, UNDP twinned up with Microsoft and have been involved in a lot of training to do with entrepreneurship. 27,000 entrepreneurship trainings took place, and also over 7,000 services. We have also set up a business ecosystem initiative where we provide investment, information, and innovation ways of how to look at this element. We also supported and worked with the government of Rwanda to launch the Youth Connect Regional Hub. And this is a portal that provides prizes for youth who address these challenges. So it's an innovative way for the private sector to get involved with the youth and acknowledge their involvement. We also have been involved in agriculture. As you know, 60% of sub-Saharan African labor force is involved in agriculture, and it's providing 25% of the GDP here in the continent. So it is an area that we have to be involved in. And UNDP has implemented agro-business supplier development program, where we're involved in enhancing the skills of the small, medium enterprises and linking with that global value chains. Also on the Green Climate Fund, as you know, UNDP is one of the implementing partners. And as you know, in the Green Climate Fund, you need investment. So twin up with a private sector and together with the government, help to implement some area around the environment, be it in agriculture, conservation agriculture, be it in groundwater, be it in water resources, be it in environmental conservation. So there's a whole lot of opportunities where the UNDP has twinned up with the private sector on that level. And there's also another, what we call a development finance assessment tool that we've been using, which is to help countries to look at their resources to see how they can finance these sustainable development goals. And this has been now already rolled out in about 20 countries. But let me come here to Botswana and look at what's happened, the exciting things that's happening here in Botswana. Botswana volunteered, one of 43 countries, to go to New York this year and tell the story of what they're doing on SDGs. Because this year the theme was around poverty. And they went, a team, and I was honored to be part of that delegation. But Botswana was also part of that delegation. And the delegation told to the world what's happening here. And also told about the institutional structures that are set up in Botswana. The Ministry of Finance, as I've said, is leading, and they have set in place various structures, and the private sector and others are working towards being part of these structures so that they can have a voice at the table in saying how things will be rolled out here in Botswana. I'll also give another example. We are also working with Botswana and the Business Investment Centre and the Botswana Chamber of Mines in terms of rolling out, again, a supplier development program. They are the lead big company, and the idea is that the program that UNDP supports is how to support the medium, smaller businesses to have the quality of product that's required by the De Beers and by the Botswanas. So that's an initiative that is about to be rolled out here. We're also working with the Bankers Association and also the Stock Exchange and seeing how we can bring sustainability principles into their practices. So on one level, if we are working with the Bankers Association, for example, in their lending practices, how can they introduce sustainability principles? And on the other side, they won't do that unless there's a potential for profit. On the other side, what we're doing is working with districts here, doing economic analysis, coming up with bankable solutions. So when the bank offers funds, those developing the proposals have already taken into account what it is the banks are looking for. So it's the right arm addressing the left arm. So there's some really exciting opportunities happening here in Botswana. So I would just like to conclude, because I know there'll be opportunities for discussion, to say I very much invite the private sector. I know that Price Waterhouse and Cooper already did a study, and it showed that 71% of private sector companies around the world are already thinking about and doing something with SDGs. So I'd like to welcome, encourage and support the partnership of the private sector, be it with the governments, be it with academic organizations, be it with the UN family, be it with the youth. But your role is important. So I'd like to conclude by saying your partnership and your role in addressing those big development challenges is so important. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jacinta. As you can see, that the individual walking up on the stage is not William Kennedy. William Kennedy will be here this afternoon and will participate a little bit later on. He is caught up in some travel logistics, fun and games. The person who just joined us on the right is Annette Richardson. Annette is the Senior Advisor to the Undersecretary General and Executive Director of UN Women, as well as the former Senior Advisor for Private Sector Partnerships in the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General under Ban Ki-moon. So welcome, Annette.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe.
Before we get to you, Annette, let's talk a little bit, just sort of the contextualizing the SDGs. I mean, you did a great job of that, Jacinta, but I think that there's still a lot of confusion, particularly in the private sector, when you see 17 goals and 169 targets and 230 some indicators. I forget what they're called, but it's a lot. And figuring out where to start, because they're aspirations that I think all of us can readily agree to as things that the change we want to see in the world. But as a company, someone who manages a P&L, who has employees, is trying to get through the day, the week, the month, and do the right thing, this seems daunting. What do you say to companies that are trying to say, yes, I want to be part of this, but it's just too much?
Mm-hmm. I would look at this in terms of two levels. If you look at it from the private sector company itself, I believe that when they're in a country, not alone do they want to produce the best product, but they want to be gracious to the work and the people that they live in. And by that act, the manner in which they work, let me give an example. If you're involved in some aspect that may involve working with the environment and taking products from the natural environment, I believe it's your responsibility to really make sure that how you work protects and conserves the environment. And by that act, you're automatically addressing some of the Sustainable Development Goals. But we shouldn't just look at it in terms of the focus of the private sector. We have seen, and Botswana is a very good example, they don't, in their support to try and achieve the SDGs, they're not confining themselves to just the area of expertise in which they work. They have moved outside of that, and they have worked with local authorities and at subnational level here and said, what's your need? And you all have seen it, the brochures are on the table where they're working in health and education. So under the corporate social responsibility. But that's the bigger level. And we invite and encourage that. But let's talk, what's in it for a small, medium enterprise? And I think it's around the how of you do your business. If you're involved in producing some response and rolling out agriculture, for example, it's how you do that work, be it conservation agriculture, that will lead to both your poverty reduction, but protecting the environment, providing employment, and so on. So there is an entry point for every level.
I don't disagree with any of that. I totally get that, and I think we could all make a very good case that whether it's a small, medium-sized enterprise or a very, very large one, that engaging with the Sustainable Development Goals makes you a better business, and more efficient, lower risk, ability to attract and retain talent. If you're consumer-facing, the customer, maybe attract and retain customers as well. But I still want to get into this sort of how do you tactically figure out what to do first or second? I mean, is it, first of all, I mean, I think a lot of companies are currently already mapping what they're doing to the 17 goals and saying, okay, well, we're already working on 6 of those. Is that enough? Is that a good start?
Actually, I think most around the world, I think that is the entry point most people have been doing. There is this lead ministry that I spoke of, and the responsibility of the lead ministry together with other ministries is to define what's relevant. Not all 17 goals is relevant in every country. And some may decide, some are relevant and I want them to do it in 5 years. Others says, no, it's okay, we'll do it for 15 years. So that, the act of doing that, what we call a relevance exercise, is usually done by the government and the lead agency. There is the real opportunity and starting entry point for the private sector. Because once they see what that government have prioritized, and again, there's an opportunity. But the starting point is finding out what that government has already prioritized, what is it they want to do, taking that as your starting point and say, how can I help? Right. And knocking on doors and say, how can I help?
So looking at first of all, what maybe a triage of these 4 or 5 definitely are at the heart of what we do as a company. These half dozen, maybe we're never going to be part of us, and in the middle there might be some, and sort of going through that exercise, and then through that starting to zero in, because I think it's just confusing for a lot of companies because it is so much.
And maybe I just come back and add to this. It is about prioritizing. You cannot be involved in all 17 goals and all 169 targets. You will take where it is that is best reflects your talents and where you want to grow with your organization. Right. But I would say stay with it. Let's not jump in and stay for a year and then move out. Because if we want the principles of leave nobody behind and sustainability, that takes time. So the idea is to work with your partner, develop that relationship with whomever you want to work with. That takes time, developing relationships, because you have to build up the trust. You have to agree who's doing what's the functions and roles, and stay with the long haul. And wait to see the impact. Wait to see that impact. Right. And then together demonstrate your results.
Yeah. And of course, this isn't just up to any individual business or even all businesses combined. This is truly a partnership of the public and private sector and civil society. And partnerships, in fact, I guess it's this goal 17 is about creating these kind of partnerships. So that's embedded in the SDGs. Annette, you used to run, I think, the UN Office for Partnerships, or Advise. I'm sorry, and you're still connected there.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about the UN's role in these partnerships. What can the UN do to create partnerships?
Yeah, and that's I think that's the $1 million question, right? I think that, I look at the sort of corporate social responsibility in sort of different eras. And if I look back at when Secretary General Kofi Annan created the UN Office for Partnerships, which was really a result of the $1 billion, I think maybe some of you may remember when Ted Turner gave $1 billion to the UN, which was unprecedented for a philanthropist. there began, I think, the kind of journey toward how can the UN better communicate with the private sector. Where are the entry points for the private sector to work with what's essentially a government institution? Our clients are governments, first and foremost, at the UN. And where can we find, ways to really build sustainable partnerships for not just the agendas, but also, I think, how can we support civil society across? How can we? So for me, I think of it from the, looking at the past 17 years of where the UN has been very active, and I've been part of that activation of corporate leaders into the UN. What are the things that works, right? I come from the private sector. I spent 25 years of my career in the energy sector as well as in the media sector, and so I understand the language of the private sector. It sometimes is at odds with the language of the UN. Oftentimes it is at odds because I think the bottom lines are, the agendas are sometimes different.
So how do we get past that, and what?
Yeah, I think that for me, I think the SDGs are a huge opening. I think the private sector can find itself in the 17 goals, as Jacinta remarkably, presented, and the 169 targets, which are real, concrete ways to really activate around advancing the agenda. The other thing I think that has changed in the last, I would say, probably 10 years is, or maybe 20, and you can certainly confirm that, is this sort of different market penetration in least developing or least developed or developing countries, that really changes the ethos of corporate leaderships and looking at what the communities look like, how to create better consumers, or certainly sometimes even create consumer bases. And I think all these factors have, it's sort of the perfect storm, if you wish, where we can really get much more interest from the private sector around a UN agenda.
Can you tell us a story about a partnership that you've seen that has worked and maybe a good model for SDGs going forward?
Yeah, I think that there is, so I can talk about specifically Coca-Cola and Nokia, looking at engender, and looking at how can, and it's a fabulous partnership because you have two very big corporations that have come together in a country here in sub-Saharan Africa, looking at digital access for women's entrepreneurs. Coca-Cola has this massive distribution network, and Nokia has this is really leading in communication, in digital communication, and so they came together and really provided the framework. So that worked with UN Women.
What was the UN's role in that, or did you broker that arrangement?
Sure. Yeah, I think that one thing that has also changed with the UN is there are now, within each of the agencies, UN Women being the youngest agency, it's only 6 years old, corporate or private sector focal points that are focusing on, this sort of alignment between what the private sector is doing in their corporate social responsibility or their foundation work, and sometimes core, and the UN needs. And I have to say, for example, on the UN Women's side, we have about 350 programs where we're actually looking for private sector partners. So that's a lot, that's a big menu of programs we're looking for.
So these are programs that were initiated within the UN, and you're saying now let's go out and find.
These are programs where the UN has identified the needs for capacity, resources, technology, all sorts of support from the private sector that remain empty. I mean, we're just trying to find partners for those.
How do you do that? How would any company in the room or watching the live stream, how would they find out what they are and get involved?
Well, I think some of them, I would say to company, if you want to get involved, if you want to understand what the UN is doing in terms of funds and programs, go to UN agencies' websites. Some of them have become very good at marketing what they are doing and what they're looking for, you know, trying to understand. You know, De Beers, for example, just signed recently a partnership with UN Women on their He for She, on UN Women He for She campaign. So I think that words.
So go to the website. Is that the?
Yeah, you go to the website. There's no UN clearinghouse where you can find, unfortunately, where we can match needs, supply and demand, if you wish. So unfortunately, it's still very kind of manual way. But my role at the UN has always been to convene the private sector in a very kind of and bring high-level UN official to these conversations and start engaging and massaging a sort of kind of creating a network of public-private leaders.
Sounds like you might want to add that clearinghouse to your list of projects.
Yeah, that's a big project.
Jacinta, when you see the public and the private sector working together, where do you see the obstacles, and how are you working, and what can be done, or just where have you seen it sort of get past those obstacles?
To me, I see is creating the linkages. Like it's the question you asked at the beginning: how does the private sector get involved? How do they know?
Where do you start?
Where did they start? Which door did they knock on? And that's often a challenge because, first of all, these SDGs were perceived to be something government did. First UN, it was considered to be UN, but they're not, they're member states. But so it is the question, where do you start? I would suggest that in countries that the private sector begin to try to find out who is leading on SDGs in that country and start to try to be on platforms of discussions.
When you say who is leading, are you talking about whether it's the public or the private sector, or which organization or which company? What does that mean?
Yeah, let me explain. In every country, there will be one ministry that will have been assigned in that country to be the lead ministry. But every other ministry, they're expected to be implementing SDGs. So if you go to any ministry in a government, they know about the SDGs because they already have owned them and brought them into their plans. So they'll be aware. You don't need necessarily to go to the lead. You can go to any ministry. If you go to the Ministry of Health and Wellness here, they'll know about the SDGs and targets, and you say, I want to help. So that's one way, knock on the door of government. The second way is knock on the door of the UN, as we heard, the UN family. The UN family, because there's many agencies, and here in Botswana there's 9 UN agencies, and come to the UN building or go on the website and knock on that door. And again, I have a number of website links in page that I'll leave for anyone to connect to any of the things I've said in terms of links today. But I would really encourage the private sector to watch out for conferences, discussions. It might only be a discussion on some detail on health, but try to be present there. The moment you're in the first platform or the first conference, automatically move to another and to another. So have your PR people reach out and be part of discussions that are going on nationally, and then bring it back to your own table and say, is this an area that I'd like to help, is this not? But the UN family, as I say, all of the various agencies have already a lot of documentation, but the government ministry sites will all be talking to SDGs. Where UN plays a role is they become a tripartite. They become an enabler to bring the private sector and the government together. But it doesn't have to be with the UN. The private sector can work directly with, for example, the youth, or they can work with the university, or they can work with the government. But because of the work that the UN have been doing in the past, they become that good tripartite to arrange those links and to provide the medium for discussion and bridge the gap of the talk. So as I say, this tripartite, or it can be bilateral. And that, again, that's one of the ways that we can start.
You mentioned SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises before, and the important role that they can play and should play in all of this. But the kinds of things that you talked about going to conferences, having your PR people. You know, so a lot of these companies, some in the room, and many of them are part of the supply chains of companies in the room. They don't have those kinds of resources. They don't have full-time staff who can really read up on and get engaged. So how, at a sort of tactical level, how do they get involved?
So let me use the entry point of associations. You have, for example, a bankers association. You may have an agricultural association. You have a small medium enterprise association. The UN family will be working with these associations. And the idea is to encourage the association to promote the good principles of SDGs. So it's true, that small medium may never have heard. But if that association is willing to promote the good principles of SDGs, then the association is the conduit to that small medium enterprise. And while they may not be aware of it, by how they do business is contribution to the SDGs without ever going to any conference or any platform. So please also look at associations in a country, because they're about helping to bring about good working practices and principles. They're a very good entry point as well.
Annette, how is the UN working with SMEs?
The UN wants to actually, the UN believes that SMEs are key to really moving and advancing the SDGs. And I agree with that thinking. I think that there are two things. There is, in terms of really reaching those goals, there are, I always think about scale, right? And then you have the how you can move forward in a much more, in a more scalable way, and then how you can actually start really building the next generations of companies that are going to be sustainable. And I think, you know, you have to think of it in kind of two fashion. The issues that are, that are facing us today, how can we actually be able to try to mitigate a lot of these issues? And I think we're looking at large corporations that can actually help us move there. And then I think in terms of SMEs, for me, it's really the sort of new generations of companies that will be sustainable. There's an opportunity there to really create this new era of companies. So I think of it that way. I also think of it as the UN believes that the SMEs are, the driver of future, and looking at all the goals and the targets that we can really, in terms of poverty alleviation, in terms of capacity building, in terms of, tomorrow we'll have a big conversation here. De Beers is organizing an entrepreneurship catalyst summit. That's what it is about. And so this is the future of really, looking at alleviating a lot of the global issues. I wanted to touch on something I think that was important, is that partnership is also, one, I think in terms of association, look at your Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce have done extraordinary amount of work in convening big conversations around the SDGs and sustainability, and really engaging their local businesses around that. So that's an easy one to really get involved. The other thing is, I want to touch a little bit on the partnership building, because I do think it's not about just the sort of partnership with the UN, right? I think actually part of it is very challenging to do business with the UN, I would say, I would argue. But earlier I talked about this Nokia Coca-Cola partnership that supports a UN program. That, I think, is the smart partnerships. So it's not just about, companies are challenged by, have come to me, and I've had a lot of CEOs come to me and say, I don't want to do business with governments. I'm not interested in investing in governments. And so to that I say, you don't have to. I mean, the key is that if you can really work with an NGO, right, and support that structure,
or work with other peer companies that are really trying to tackle a particular issue in your communities, the better. Work with entrepreneurs and really support that through innovation hubs and other things. So there are, ways.
Lots of ways to do that.
Lots of ways for corporations to actually, yes, engage within the agenda.
So it strikes me that if we're going to really do this and succeed, and we haven't talked about this much, that we really need public will. I mean, public, after all, are our employees, our shareholders, our customers, our families, our communities, and they really need to be at the table. At least they need to have our backs, so that as we go out and start engaging and acting and ultimately scaling, that they get it and they're at part of it. They're supportive. I haven't seen yet a lot of public awareness of it. Terrific video. I love that video. I've seen it a couple times, and or at least once. And that's exactly what we need, just at least to get people. Wow, SDGs. That's cool. Why wouldn't we do that? And I think that's sort of the opportunity. If we can really do all those things, if we really can end hunger and poverty, and heal the planet, and bring opportunity to women, and economic equity to all, and opportunity and inclusion, and all of these things, why wouldn't we do that? How do we get the public engaged?
Awareness is something that every country has undertaken, and my plea is that the awareness should be over 15 years, not just the first year. What happened, and I'll give the example of Botswana. Botswana, long before 2015, as I mentioned earlier, had public discussions, both within the government, in the public, and at sub-district level and district level, on what should the developing challenges that Botswana will focus on. So that created an awareness then. But you're right. When we look at this video, we're automatically assuming innovation, TVs, and the lot. And that's one channel, but there are a whole lot of other channels. And I think in the room, it's our role as well that when we have, like these conferences, an opportunity to talk about it, let's promote it. In the parliaments, I believe our parliaments can do much more. I believe our MPs can do much more. And they bring it to the fore. But also, I think that, and now I will task myself to make sure, as the UN family, that we are encouraging the government to knock on the doors of the private sector and providing the opportunity for talking. When I mentioned earlier on that the lead ministry in a country, they have what we call a steering committee that's set up and they meet so often. Now I will be encouraging that the private sector sits on the steering committee, and that goes back through the associations, be it the Bankers Association, be it the Mining Association, or whatever. So have them sit on platforms so they're aware. But also help engage the private sector so they may be willing to put ads in the newspapers, into the TVs, on creating an awareness of SDGs. But because there's so many players, we can't just leave that to the private sector, because we have to get involved, both the people out there, and again, lots of schools do a lot of work on this. Curriculums have been changed, so they're bringing SDGs as examples into curriculums in schools. We have the university in Botswana here, the Botswana University. It's engaged quite a lot on doing research. Now, there are ample opportunities for the private sector to twin up with the government, with universities, and again, let them help in terms of this advocacy. But I say this, just by wearing this, it's a small, simple step. It's about advocating. Somebody will ask you, what's it about? And let us try to demystify the goals. As you say, when you talk about 17 goals, the first reaction is, oh my gosh, how can this be done? I didn't talk at all about measuring. That is another, I'll use the word in a nice way because I'm in Botswana, another elephant in the room, because elephants are such a prized possession here. But how do we go about measuring? We say we will do all these things, but how do we measure that we're actually achieving it? And hence the reason for these wonderful 230 indicators. But we have to have systems to measure. But not just at this level. We have to have systems to measure right down at the village level. And again, there's opportunities for the private sector to come on board and say, look, we've got the technology, we've got the innovation. We'll help you using mobile phones, new innovation for collecting data. It doesn't have to be the old traditional ways. But we also need to reach out to the private sector as well as them reaching us. But also, I keep coming back to this aspect, the private sector has the expertise on innovation. And this, if we call these development challenges a transformational agenda, we need innovation.
Right.
It doesn't matter what age group, we need innovation. And the idea is the private sector is pivotal to provide that innovation. The question is, how do we link up so that they can twin and together we do the work? Because it is about being together in this.
Yeah.
I think for me, I'll go even further. I don't think that brands or corporations have a choice today to kind of sit on the sidewalk. I think that people are demanding some sort of alignment with good, period. And I think that corporations that will continue on sitting on the side, looking kind of, on the outside, I think will either collapse or will just fail. I think that the power now is in the hands of people, and we see that politically, we see that socially, we've seen that now over the last, certainly with the kind of the emergence of the internet and digital technology. I think people have the power. And I think that if brands are not listening to people and consumers, I think they will be left on the side. So the SDGs are about people. People, and Jacinta, I think, shared that earlier. This consultation of people that came and really shaped what the SDGs are about. It's about people. This is the future that people want to see. So this is not just coming out of, diplomats in the room or UN official or government official. This is about people. And I think if brands are not listening to their consumers and not talking to their consumers the way the consumers wants to be spoken to, I think they will fail.
Yeah.
And I think that's ultimately, I don't have a timeline, but I think that we're looking at it it's coming very fast.
Yeah.
I think the demand we saw, for example, in Silicon Valley with the meltdown of a couple of companies because of behavioral issues, you see immediate response of boycotting a brand. So I think there is, the responsibility is on both sides, but I do think that people will have more and more influence on brands.
And to be clear, these companies, very few of them are actually using the phrase SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals. They're taking on the issues. They're saying we're committed to female empowerment. We're committed to.
I mean, some of them talk about sustainability. Yeah, I agree. I think they are still very much thinking in a silo way. I look at the SDG as an ecosystem. I don't think you can think about. I think about gender as a lens, not as an issue. So I think that gender is everywhere. It's not just a gender issue. I think it's, you have to think of it very cohesively, and I think from an ecosystem way. You can't think about education if you don't have health. You can't talk about, poverty without talking about education and health. And
right.
I mean, so
I don't disagree with you, but I also think this is where it gets overwhelming and confusing. And to some extent, if you to focus it just on, I'll take the other side of that argument.
For sure.
If you to focus on female empowerment, well, you have to look at that in your workforce, in your supply chain, in your customer base, in your community, and within each of those, there's a number of different programs and policies and projects that you can take on. And so in some ways, some of those may involve health or education or climate or water or a number of other things. But by looking at it through those lenses, it may give a company more clarity about how to get at this without. And everything is a system, and I don't disagree with anything you said there. But this is where companies just get overwhelmed and in the process paralyzed. You're shaking your head, nodding your head.
I disagree, but
this aspect of the language is an interesting one, and it's this. We know around the world that currently the whole issue of health is being addressed. Poverty has been addressed. Environment has been addressed. We don't necessarily have to use the word Sustainable Development Goals. It's been addressed already. What has happened is that the development goals has provided the opportunity to say the same thing in a new language, but it's gone a little bit further. By placing a target, so if we talk about health, we just don't want to talk about health in general, because how do you measure what progress you're making? That's when the target comes in. So we set targets. The nice thing about targets, you can compare and you can aspire to a particular level of development after whatever number of years. So what the SDGs does, by bringing that language, it is pushing a target on a development issue and connecting you to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
That's all. But let's be frank. Once we're doing health, there's nothing different we're doing in the SDGs. It's just a development framework that puts a target, as I say, that helps us to aspire to a particular level. But it introduces new principles. The principle of sustainability, universality, inclusiveness, innovation, many things. So it's just tweaking the agenda to a more comprehensive, inclusive agenda. And it's having every nation around the world saying, we believe in these principles and we believe in these targets. Otherwise, various countries would do whatever. So it provides a tool for citizens to believe that we are aspiring to a development level.
Are we taking audience questions at this? Oh, okay, good. That was what timing? Look at that. Audience questions. Here we go.
We thought we still had 55 minutes.
No, forget that. We got 10. So how do we do this? Are there microphones about? Is there other mics we can hold them up? More important are the questions that we can take on. Or I know we sprung that on you. We can ask another one here and then come back to you. But we got two extraordinarily knowledgeable women about this whole world of SDGs. There's got to be some questions. Well, while you're thinking about that, let's go back to. Do you want to respond before you said you weren't?
Yeah, I think we have to be. I wanted to respond to you actually about your point about this sort of, the tackling some of these goals are very overwhelming. We just have to. I think one of the issues as to why the MDGs were not achieved and is because I think the
MDGs were the
MDGs,
Millennial Development
and
Goals
moving into the SDGs
preceded these.
I think that it's partly because of that. I think this sort of silo of looking at, I can only tackle so much on a particular issue, I think is a big mistake. I do think that, going back to gender, for example, thinking about a very large tech company that had big investment into gender programs and yet failed drastically in terms of leadership. And I won't name them, but I think that you probably know who they are. And that is exactly, I think that responds to your point is I don't agree. I think it has to be so much more comprehensive, and it has to be an ecosystem within the company as well as any sort of investment that they can make on the outside. So, and that company is going through tremendous ordeal.
So maybe it's both and, where you look at the big picture and how the connectivity of let's again just to stay on that, women's issues with health issues with education, with climate change, but be able to tackle them in some focused way.
That's right. Yeah. You cannot support gender programs and then have a completely different policy within your organization. Just doesn't work.
I'm still looking for hands out there.
No hands.
No hands. Okay. Oh, there's one. We got one in the back over here.
Oh,
If we can
there.
get you a microphone. Thank you. Thank you for stepping up, literally. Could you introduce yourself briefly, too, as well?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bunise Chele. I have been involved in what we call self-leadership for a long time now. And what we've noticed is the world is excited about giving an individual tools, like they will make you an accountant, an engineer, a doctor, or whatever. But what we have forgotten is this tool should be driven by a man, the inner man now. I can give you an example. If you take somebody and give them a law degree, the world has to make that person an attorney. And it requires the world to deal with the heart now, because it is the heart that dreams. It is the heart that pushes this tool that is in the head to do. So I think we should rethink. As we give you this tool called accounting or law, we should also know that you cannot use this tool until we talk to the spiritual person inside you, the heart person who drives this tool. Maybe organizations like UNDP can start now going back to restore or rebuild the family unit, because this heart man is controlled by the principles and the values from the home.
So
these things about integrity, about who you are, about where you want to go, because most of the times we'll be doing all these degrees but with no vision of what you want to do with this degree. So let us help the world to start helping this man inside to drive the tool that they have here. Thank you.
Yes, then in many ways, the way this is my own personal view, the world is changing in so much way that we are expected to be better human beings. We are expected to reflect more on who we are. And if we're in development space, we're not meant to be ruled by our heads alone. That I feel. Our educational systems in schools and universities talk to the heart. But I am pleased to say that I think that that is beginning to change. I really believe that the individual, the person, that part of who you are has to be the driver of the goals that you're putting forward. Because otherwise, what makes you work to make sure that nobody's left behind? So I agree with what the lady is saying. I say it is trying to get a balance, but if we consider SDGs hard to get an entry point, that's even harder, because it's not always a public debate or a discussion. It's not in the curriculums necessarily in school, but we're getting there, and I think that space is opening up. But yes, I agree. If we really are for the values that are behind and the principles behind the SDGs, then it's a head and heart response.
I agree completely, and I think that, you know, what sustainable development is all about is a combination of very tangible science and metrics and goals and complexity on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's about our bodies and our families and our communities and our way of life and our culture. And you can't, if you anybody who's been in this for any length of time knows that if you go just a little bit in too far in one direction, you just lose your audience. It's either too, it's unfeeling or it's too touchy-feely or something. And through storytelling and I think potentially through the Sustainable Development Goals, we can integrate head and heart by bringing all of us and each of us and all of each of us to that conversation. So I'm with you on that one. And that
Yeah, I think it's definitely a head and heart. I think it's about building, safe, productive, equitable society, and people want that. I think it's about the people, and it's about the system that will be put, whether they're a corporate system, whether they're a governmental system, that will really benefit people. And I think that's ultimately, I'm a little It's true, it's in the heart, although one can argue that philanthropy was also in the heart. I'm not sure that philanthropy is a sustainable, system. So I think I want to be cautious about, yes, we need to really, for me it's fundamentally about really the embedment, and it's about equity. It's just about equity for people.
But you talk about corporations and political leaders, and as if all this is top down. And I think I heard
it's about people too. I think it's the people that are actually driving the SDGs.
In the community level, I think. Do you see this happening where a lot of this is being driven from the community, the grassroots, the ground level, up, and then, as we see certainly in lots of parts of the world, where eventually the politicians see a parade and then they want to get in front of it.
Yes. I think, again, I'll use the example of Botswana. When, as I mentioned, in the consultation of defining what the development goals are about, a lot of youth organizations right down there were very active. When the delegation went to New York on telling the progress, the youth was part of it, and the community was part of it. And we had the mayor of Francistown also part of the delegation, to make sure, exactly as you're saying, it's not about just the government. This is about not only persons, both as an actor and a beneficiary, because you play both of those roles.
Right.
As a citizen, because the whole idea is, how do we get the citizens talking about SDGs? We have categorized them into groupings here this morning through, say, in the governments and private sector. But at the end of the day, it's about a citizen. Whether I'm working in the UN or I'm a citizen, I benefit or should help or contribute. So I play multiple roles in that. So I believe that right down at that lowest level, bringing it up even into your home, we have a role to have it, even the children speak about it, draw diagrams. Like I remembered in my previous workstation where I was before I came to Botswana, we had lots of competitions at school at the lowest level, and they did drawings. And it was fascinating to see a drawing of what poverty looked like, or what inequality looked like. So that's the idea. It's how to engage everybody. And again, we all have a role to play in that engagement process.
So we're going to get the hook here in a second. So let me ask one final question. When we meet back here, the three of us, at Diamond Conference 2022, 5 years from now, what's the conversation about SDGs that you hope that we're having?
Personally, it's not about who'll be doing what. I think here we'll be having lots of examples of what we've done and how we have connected with all the different levels. That's how I see it. It's not about determining what is your role. That will already be behind us. The expectation is that it'll be showcasing all the work that's out there and coming up with ideas that we haven't even thought about now, and really letting innovation and your heart run with what that is, and demonstrating that some of the targets are already achieved. Why? Because all of us have come on board to help.
Annette, what do you want to see?
In 2020?
2020, 2022, pick your year.
I think I want to see probably, double the size of this room, and I want to see a lot of site holders and shareholders of De Beers, and certainly partners of the government here of Botswana here on stage.
Yeah.
And really, having made the commitments and really being on the path to really incorporating, or, certainly the SDGs into their business, their communities. So that's what I'd like to see.
So lots more people with lots more stories of success.
Correct.
I think that's a good goal. Let's go for that. Please join me in thanking Jacinta Barrins and Annette Richardson.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joel, and to your two panelists. Very insightful conversation. I think a very good job was done of properly contextualizing exactly what the SDGs are. I think it broke it down very, very simply and really gave a proper picture of the role of business and the key leadership position that business has to play, that business has been given with the now 13 years that we have until 2030. And I think it really sets the tone for the rest of the discussions for today. The second plenary will be happening in just a few minutes, and that's going to discuss challenges and successes of sustainability in the diamond industry and beyond. This plenary session will be divided in two, but just as you go into the next sort of refreshment break and start to link maybe that topic and what we've just heard from our panelists, this plenary will be touching on issues of the business case for sustainable development. And I know, Jacinta, you touched a little bit on that in your opening presentation. So that also set a really good, some context there. The diamond industry's contribution and impact to the SDGs themselves. What are the challenges being encountered? I mean, I know that globally, and maybe not so much in Botswana because we don't have too much of a lobby culture, there is increasing pressure on mining companies to start thinking about how they rehabilitate the land around which they do the mining. And I know De Beers, of course, as a leader there, somewhat ahead of the curve. But these are the conversations that are now being had over and above the role of mining and sustainability within the ambits of the SDGs. So it's going to be very interesting over the next two sessions to hear a little bit about that. And of course, the measurable outcomes of the SDG drive as we wrap up that plenary. But very interesting. Thank you again to our panel and to you, Joel. Great context been set. Looking forward to very insightful, very interactive, ladies and gentlemen, very interactive, hint, hint, two plenary sessions that we're going to have. Let's get back here at 11:15, please. We are behind time. And as chief timekeeper, I'd just like to remind you that at 11:15 we will be kicking off. I don't want to have to say with or without you, but at 11:15 we will be kicking off. Thank you.